Dr. Wood has been the Research Fellow in Leicester, working alongside Dr. Adlam, so between 2017 and just finished recently in 2021, and is now, in throes of analysing the data. And so Dr. Wood has been partially funded by Beat SCAD donations. So obviously we're very, very keen to hear outcomes of her work. So again, hand back to Debbie. We'll play that video. So hello, and I'm pleased to be talking again to Dr. Alice Wood, who was the SCAD Research Fellow at the Cardiovascular Research Centre at Glenfield Hospital in Leicester from 2017 through to just recently, so just finished the tenure at the end of July 2021. And the majority of the Beat SCAD donations that have been awarded to the University of Leicester so far have been used towards funding Dr. Alice Wood's PhD work. So welcome, Dr. Wood, and thank you for taking the time today to discuss your work with me. So firstly, could you just share a summary of the scope of your research project?
So the aim of it was to understand better why SCAD happens, why some people can be vulnerable and others for the same thing. So we looked at vascular reactivity to see whether people with a history of SCAD perhaps have arteries that respond more dramatically to stress than others, which may make them vulnerable to dissection. We looked at the autonomic nervous system. So this is the unconscious nervous system that controls your heart rate and blood pressure, including in terms of response to stress and things like that. We looked at exercise testing because some of our patients report either exercise as having triggered their SCAD or just having above average levels of exercise activity. And we wondered if this might be relevant, or whether, for example, people with a history of SCAD might respond more dramatically to exercise with a higher blood pressure response and things like that. And then we did cardiac MRI, primarily to look at myocardial blood flow, because we know that in the vast majority of cases, the vessels we see on angiogram heal in SCAD patients, but a proportion of patients still get chest pain. And one of the possibilities explaining that would be a problem in the microvessels that we don't see on angiogram. So we aim to study that. And during the MRI, we also did some psychological stress, relatively mild with mental arithmetic, to see if the SCAD patients responded differently to psychological stress.
Mild, that would be high for me. So you looked at subgroups, and why were those particular subgroups chosen?
So we chose to study men with SCAD and people with recurrent SCAD, in fact, women with recurrent SCAD. And there were a couple of reasons for choosing to study men, partly simply because they haven't been studied so far. Most of the registries looking at SCAD have either included the vast majority of women with a few men or focused exclusively on women. And so we thought it would be interesting to learn something about this group. And then we also know that, although we don't know the exact mechanism, that there seems to be an association with sex hormones, so pregnancy, phases of the menstrual cycle. But it can't be the only explanation because SCAD occurs in men who don't have these risk factors. So we wanted to tease out the other risk factors, and we hope that this might help. Then we studied people with recurrent SCAD, partly for a pragmatic reason that we thought these people might have a more dramatic sort of version of SCAD. That's not a definite thing, we haven't proven that, but with smaller study numbers, we might be more likely to see a difference. And so it just meant that we could power our study with fewer patients, given that we knew we couldn't study thousands of people. And the other reason was so that we can compare the recurrent cohort with the rest of the group and see if we do establish any differences.
So were there any specific questions that you aimed to look at with the research?
So it was largely exploratory, in that we didn't have a definite question that we thought this is really going to be the key to SCAD. So we're exploring various options with the aim of either confirming them or potentially ruling them out, so at least we know what else we can go on to. And these include things like whether people with SCAD might respond differently to stress from other people. They might have a higher blood pressure response, or they might be more likely to constrict their vessels. And they might have a different autonomic response in certain circumstances. And we don't expect this research to give us the holy grail of this is exactly why you had SCAD and your friend didn't. But we hope it might give us some pointers that will probably lead to further research.
Sort of teasing out bits of information and helping you to decide.
Yeah, and seeing what seemed likely and where we can take it further on. Yeah.
Yeah. And how many people did you see during your research period?
So we saw a few people, and then not all of them had all aspects of the study, but the number of people who had all aspects of the study, so we had 29 men with a history of SCAD, 27 male healthy volunteers, 23 women with recurrent SCAD, and 15 female volunteers. And then in terms of tests done, we did 94 brachial ultrasound, 89 cardiac MRI, 94 exercise tests, 93 24-hour ECGs, and then we had 23 people also come for research scans for fibromuscular dysplasia.
So you sort of touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but what sort of information could the results of those tests provide?
So the brachial ultrasound, a test called flow-mediated dilatation, is a test of the functioning of the arteries and their lining, the endothelium. And we study this in the arm because obviously it's easier to access superficial vessels in the arm by ultrasound than to study the arteries in the heart. But it's thought that it represents similar functioning. And we know that this test is abnormal in people with atherosclerotic heart disease, so cholesterol plaques. And we were interested to see whether it was also abnormal, perhaps in a different way in SCAD, or whether it would be completely identical. Then the cardiac MRI. So, as I briefly mentioned, we know that most people with a history of SCAD have normal arteries if we do a follow-up angiogram. But we don't see the smaller vessels, the ones that are actually in the heart muscle itself, whereas MRI allows us to assess these. So we were doing that, looking at response to both the drug stress agent that's quite commonly used to test for coronary disease and also to this mental arithmetic stress. Then we did cardiopulmonary exercise testing, which was people on a bicycle cycling to their maximum workload while we measured blood pressure, heart rate, gas exchange, so how much oxygen they were using and carbon dioxide they were producing. And we were aiming to look at the blood pressure response to a particular workload, heart rate response, heart rate recovery, maximum workload attained, and see if these were different from age and sex matched healthy controls. And then finally, the 24-hour ECG was not perhaps as you might expect to look for clinical abnormalities, ECG abnormalities, but in fact to look at measures of autonomic function, so this unconscious nervous system, because that manifests in the changes in the heart rate with breathing and the changes in the heart with sleep. And so it's a way of assessing the unconscious nervous system.
And you mentioned about the healthy controls. So why was it important to have those?
So it was probably more important for some aspects of the study than others. But when you're interpreting these tests, it's not always black and white, particularly when it's things like, is there some scar on this MRI scan, or is it just an artifact of the machine or whatever? And so I wanted to analyse those without being biased by the fact, I know this patient's had a scan, so it's probably scar. So the scans were done under anonymisation codes. I didn't know whose scan I was looking at when I analysed them. So they shouldn't be biased by any preconceptions I may have had about the outcome of the study.
So you've generated lots of data. Takes you a while to wade through it or review it, make sense of it. What happens once you've completed the analysis?
So I'm working on the statistical analysis now. And once I've done some basic analyses, I'll share these with the rest of the team in Leicester. And we'll discuss how best to take them forward, whether to do further analyses, to look at things in a different way with different statistical tests. Then once we've done all that, I hope to finish my thesis and submit that, which will be my first aim. And then once that's done, or potentially at the same time, also write it up in the form of a research paper so that it can be shared more widely with the scientific community and anyone else who wants to read it. This is quite a lengthy process, and what we end up producing will depend a bit on what we find. As if we find some really dramatic differences, it's quite likely that journals will be keen to publish the article. Whereas although if we don't find differences, it's still important, it tends not to excite people quite so much. So we will still publish the data, but maybe in a different format. And once we're at the stage of publishing that, there's always review by co-authors, review by reviewers at the journal. So it always takes a few months. That would be the next aim.
Yeah. And of course, you're actually back in clinical practice now, aren't you? So
yeah.
Finding the time to do this work, on top of your day job, if you like, that must be challenging as well. So it will add to the timeline.
Yeah, we get days off after weekends on call.
Yeah. And I mean, during your tenure, it wasn't just about doing the research project. You helped Dr. Aglam with the SCAD clinic that runs each week. So, how did that experience, work alongside the research? Was there benefits to it?
So, it was particularly helpful at the beginning, I think, to get an idea of the symptoms people presented with after SCAD, triggers they reported, so that we could develop hypotheses to test. So it was useful in getting to know the condition, both in terms of patient symptoms and also getting familiar with angiograms and things like that. Yes, it helps in generating the research hypotheses.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for talking to me. It's really interesting to hear about the steps that you're going through. I hope everything goes well with your analysis and completion of your thesis. We, of course, look forward to hearing the results when you reach that point. And really, I'd just, on behalf of the whole SCAD community, I'd like to thank you for all your hard work. You've been a strong part of the team for a long time. So we're sad to see you leave the team. But we're keen to see what comes of the research, and thank you again for all your contributions to the SCAD clinic. That's such an important part of the service that patients need, and I know that you've provided such a lot of support to people, answering questions via email, telephone follow-ups and everything, so it really has been appreciated.
I couldn't have done the project without the people who kindly volunteered for the study. So.
Yeah. Lovely. Okay, well, I will let you get back to your busy schedule. And thanks again for talking to me. So I hope that was interesting. I think we've learnt a bit more information from Dr. Wood there, and obviously, it really demonstrates how much is involved in the research, and also from Dr. Tina Chrysikou as well. These are long processes to get things up and running, and to gather the data and to get everything analysed. So I think the fact that we've already seen so much output and publications coming out just shows you, how dedicated these various research teams are, and all the hard work that's going on there. And there's more to come. So it's exciting times.